Commander Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the Earth Defense Station, watching the stars through the massive viewport when the first warning came through, and his heart sank as the sensor operator called out contact signatures appearing at the edge of the solar system, and there were hundreds of them moving fast toward Earth. And he had trained for this moment his entire military career. But nothing could prepare anyone for what was coming, and the swarm had been detected 3 months ago by deep space probes destroying colonies on the outer rim, and now they were here, and Earth was their target. And Jake looked at his crew, seeing fear in their young faces, but also determination because they knew what was at stake. The swarm ships looked like massive insects made of dark metal with sharp edges and glowing red cores, and they moved through space in perfect coordination, like a hive mind controlling every vessel. And Dr. Lisa Martinez had studied the footage from the destroyed colonies, trying to understand their technology and their tactics, but the swarm left nothing behind except ruins and radiation, and no survivors ever remained to tell what happened. And Lisa worked in the research lab deep inside the station, analyzing every piece of data they had collected, and she knew they were facing an enemy that had destroyed dozens of civilizations across the galaxy, and Earth would be next unless they found a way to fight back. Jake ordered his crew to battle stations, and the alarms blared throughout the massive orbital platform, and soldiers ran to their posts, and pilots rushed to their fighters, and engineers powered up weapon systems, and everyone moved with practiced efficiency because they had drilled for this scenario 1,000 times. And Captain Greg Stone commanded the fighter squadrons, and he was one of the best pilots in the fleet, with over 15 years of combat experience. And Greg gathered his pilots in the launch bay, giving them final instructions and checking their readiness, and he saw the mixture of excitement and terror on their faces, because this would be their first real combat against an alien enemy. Amy Chen worked in communications, coordinating with other defense stations orbiting Earth, and with military installations on the surface, and the messages flooding in painted a grim picture, because the swarm was approaching from multiple vectors, and they had more ships than anyone had anticipated, and the defense fleet was scrambling to intercept, but they were outnumbered 5-1, and Amy kept her voice calm and professional as she relayed orders and status updates. But inside she was terrified because she had family down on Earth in San Francisco, and she wondered if she would ever see them again. The first engagement happened near Mars orbit, where a small defense flotilla tried to slow the swarm advance, and Jake watched the tactical display as blue icons representing human ships moved to intercept red icons representing the enemy, and the battle lasted only minutes before the human ships were overwhelmed and destroyed, and the swarm barely slowed down, and they continued their relentless advance toward Earth, and Jake clenched his fists, knowing that thousands of good men and women had just died, buying them only a few extra hours. Lisa discovered something important while analyzing the swarm ships, and she noticed they all emitted the same frequency signal that seemed to coordinate their movements. And if they could disrupt that signal even temporarily, it might give the defense forces an advantage. And she rushed to the bridge to tell Jake her findings, and he listened carefully as she explained the technical details, and he made a decision immediately to try her plan because they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. And Lisa felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that millions of lives might depend on whether her theory was correct. Greg launched with his fighter squadron into the black void of space, and the stars surrounded him. And ahead he could see the massive swarm fleet approaching like a dark cloud, blotting out the light, and his squadron formed up in tight formation, and they accelerated toward the enemy at maximum speed. And Greg had flown combat missions before against pirates and rebels, but never against anything like this, and the swarm ships were enormous compared to the small human fighters. And he wondered how they could possibly make a difference, but orders were orders, and he would fight until the end. The defense stations opened fire when the swarm entered weapons range, and brilliant beams of energy lanced through space toward the alien ships, and missiles streaked away, leaving trails of exhaust, and explosions blossomed among the swarm formation, destroying some of the smaller vessels, but there were so many of them. And they returned fire with devastating accuracy, and the station shook as enemy weapons struck the shields, and Jake held on to his command chair as the deck tilted and sparks flew from damaged consoles, and damage reports flooded in from all sections. Amy coordinated the evacuation of non-essential personnel to the escape pods and transport ships, and she worked efficiently. Despite the chaos around her, and explosions rocked the station as the swarm pressed their attack, and she kept talking to the evacuation teams, guiding them to the nearest escape routes and making sure everyone had a chance to survive. And she thought about her family again, and sent a quick message to her parents telling them she loved them and hoping they would receive it. Lisa worked frantically in her lab, building a device that could emit the disruption signal she had theorized about, and her hands moved quickly, connecting circuits and calibrating frequencies, and she ignored the alarms and the shaking station and focused only on her work, because this might be humanity's only chance, and the device was crude and untested, but it was all they had, and she finished the final connections and activated it, and waited to see if her calculations were correct. Greg engaged the swarm fighters in close combat, and his squadron weaved through the enemy formation, firing weapons and dodging return fire, and he destroyed 2 enemy ships before one of his wingmen was hit and exploded in a ball of fire. And Greg gritted his teeth and continued fighting because stopping meant death, and the swarm ships were incredibly maneuverable, but they seemed to rely on their coordination, and when Lisa's disruption signal activated, the enemy ships suddenly became confused, and their perfect formation broke apart. Jake saw the effect immediately on his tactical display, and the swarm ships were no longer moving in perfect synchronization, and they were making mistakes and colliding with each other, and the human forces pressed the advantage, attacking with renewed vigor. And Jake allowed himself a moment of hope, because maybe Lisa's plan was working and maybe they could actually win this battle. But then the swarm adapted and new signals replaced the old ones, and their coordination returned stronger than before. The battle raged for hours, and the defense stations fought desperately against overwhelming odds, and one by one the orbital platforms fell as the swarm overwhelmed their defenses, and Jake knew they were losing, and he made the hardest decision of his life and ordered the remaining stations to retreat and fall back to Earth, and it felt like surrender. But it was the only way to save what was left of the defense forces, and Amy transmitted the retreat order to all units, and her voice cracked with emotion. Greg received the retreat order and felt anger and frustration, but he obeyed because discipline was everything in combat, and he rallied what remained of his squadron, and they turned back toward Earth, and behind them the swarm fleet continued its advance, and the alien ships were now in orbit around Earth. And they began their assault on the surface, and cities burned as energy weapons struck from space, and millions died in the first hour. And Jake watched helplessly as his homeworld burned. Lisa gathered her research data and prepared to evacuate the station. And she knew her disruption signal had worked temporarily, but the swarm had adapted too quickly, and she needed more time to develop something better. And she fled to the escape pods with the other survivors and launched away from the dying station. And behind her the massive platform exploded as the swarm ships tore it apart, and she watched through the small window as humanity's first line of defense vanished in fire. Jake made it to a transport ship along with Amy and what remained of his command crew, and they descended toward Earth through a sky filled with falling debris and enemy fire, and the transport shook violently as it entered the atmosphere. And Jake looked out at the world below, seeing cities burning and coastlines shattered, and he wondered if humanity could survive this and whether they would have any home left to defend. And the transport landed hard in a military base in Colorado, and Jake stepped out into chaos. The swarm had won the first battle, and Earth's orbital defenses were destroyed and millions were dead, and the alien ships controlled the space around the planet, and they continued their bombardment, methodically destroying military targets and population centers, and humanity's armies tried to fight back with ground-based weapons, but they could barely scratch the swarm ships, and Jake gathered with other surviving commanders in an underground bunker, and they faced the terrible truth that Earth was falling, and they needed a new plan because conventional warfare had failed, and humanity's survival now depended on their ability to adapt and fight in ways the swarm would never expect. The underground bunker in Colorado became the new command center for what remained of Earth's military forces, and Jake Harrison stood in the war room surrounded by holographic displays showing the devastation across the planet and the swarm controlled. The skies and their ships hovered over major cities like dark clouds, and the bombardment continued day and night, and refugees fled into the countryside seeking shelter anywhere they could find it, and the world's armies were scattered and disorganized, and communication networks were damaged, making coordination difficult. Dr. Lisa Martinez set up a new laboratory in a section of the bunker, and she worked with a small team of scientists trying to understand the swarm technology better, and they had recovered fragments of destroyed enemy ships from orbit, and Lisa studied the alien materials, finding them unlike anything on Earth, and the metal seemed to be alive in some way, responding to electromagnetic signals, and she realized the swarm ships were not just machines but extensions of a larger organism. And this discovery changed everything, because if they could understand how the hive mind worked, they might find a weakness. Captain Greg Stone survived the retreat from orbit and landed with his remaining pilots at the Colorado base, and they had lost over 60% of their squadron in the battle, and Greg felt the weight of every lost pilot because he had trained with them and fought beside them. And now they were gone. And he sat alone in his quarters that night, trying to process the trauma of the battle and wondering if they had any chance of winning this war. And eventually he stood up and walked to the pilot ready room because staying busy was the only way to avoid thinking about the hopelessness of their situation. Amy Chen worked in the communications center, coordinating with scattered military units around the world, and she managed to establish contact with resistance groups in Europe and Asia and Australia, and they were all fighting the same desperate battle against an enemy they could barely hurt. And Amy compiled reports and intelligence trying to build a picture of the swarm strategy, and she noticed they were systematically destroying industrial centers and military bases but leaving agricultural areas relatively untouched, and this suggested they had a purpose beyond simple destruction. Jake called a meeting with his senior staff, and they gathered around a large table in the war room, and the mood was grim because everyone knew they were losing, and Jake spoke first, saying they needed a new strategy because fighting the swarm in conventional warfare was suicide, and Lisa presented her findings about the hive mind and explained that the swarm ships were all connected through some kind of biological network, and if they could sever that connection even temporarily, they might create chaos in the enemy ranks. Greg suggested using guerrilla tactics instead of direct confrontation, and he proposed small strike teams that could hit swarm ground positions and fade away before reinforcements arrived, and the other commanders agreed this was their best option, and they began planning operations to harass the enemy and slow their advance and gather intelligence, and Jake assigned Greg to lead the first strike team, and Amy would provide communication support, and Lisa would analyze any technology they captured. The swarm began landing ground forces in several locations, and their soldiers looked like mechanical spiders with multiple legs and weapons mounted on articulated arms. And they moved in coordinated groups, sweeping through areas and eliminating any resistance, and human forces that engaged them directly were quickly overwhelmed and destroyed. And Jake watched footage from a battle in New York where a full battalion was wiped out in less than an hour, and he knew they needed to be smarter and more careful. Greg assembled his strike team from volunteers who understood the mission would be dangerous, and they trained for 3 days, learning to work together and studying swarm movements and patterns, and Lisa provided them with equipment that might help disrupt enemy communications. And Greg felt a sense of purpose again because sitting idle while Earth burned was worse than any danger they might face, and his team consisted of 12 soldiers including himself, and they were ready. The first mission targeted a swarm landing zone in Kansas where enemy forces were building some kind of structure, and reconnaissance showed approximately 50 swarm soldiers guarding the site, and Greg's team moved in at night using the terrain for cover, and they approached silently and positioned themselves around the perimeter, and Greg gave the signal and they opened fire simultaneously with armor-piercing rounds and explosives, and several swarm soldiers fell before the others could react. The battle was intense and brutal, and the swarm soldiers returned fire with energy weapons that cut through cover like paper, and Greg's team kept moving using hit-and-run tactics and never staying in one place long, and they destroyed the structure the swarm was building and killed half the enemy force before retreating into the darkness, and they lost 2 team members. But the mission was a success, and it proved the swarm could be hurt if you fought. Smart Lisa examined the wreckage they brought back from the Kansas raid, and she found intact pieces of swarm technology, including a communication device, and she spent days reverse engineering it and learning how it worked. And the device used quantum entanglement to communicate instantaneously across vast distances, and she realized this was how the hive mind stayed connected. And if she could build a jammer powerful enough, it might disrupt their entire network. Amy coordinated more strike teams across the globe, and resistance fighters began hitting swarm positions everywhere, and the attacks were small but numerous, and they disrupted enemy operations and forced them to divert resources to defense. And the swarm responded by increasing patrols and fortifying their positions, and the war entered a new phase, where neither side could achieve a decisive victory, and humanity had bought time. But time for what? Jake received disturbing intelligence from multiple sources, and refugees reported seeing humans being captured alive by the swarm and taken to collection centers, and nobody knew what happened to them after that. And Jake feared the worst because the swarm had destroyed every other civilization they encountered, and there was no reason to believe they would treat humans differently. And he ordered reconnaissance teams to investigate one of these collection centers. Greg volunteered to lead the reconnaissance mission, and his team approached a collection center in what used to be Chicago, and they observed from a distance using binoculars and cameras, and what they saw chilled them to the bone, and humans were being processed through machines that seemed to scan them and sort them, and some were released while others were taken deeper into the facility. And Greg recorded everything and returned to report. Lisa watched the footage, and her face went pale because she recognized what was happening. And the swarm was harvesting genetic material from humans, and she explained that many species in the galaxy used biological technology, and the swarm might be trying to incorporate human DNA into their own forces, and this would make them even more dangerous and adaptable. And Jake felt sick thinking about what this meant for captured civilians. The situation grew more desperate as weeks passed, and the swarm expanded their control over Earth, and they now occupied most major cities and industrial centers, and human forces controlled only rural areas and remote locations, and supplies were running low, and ammunition was scarce, and medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded. And Jake knew they could not sustain this level of resistance indefinitely, and they needed something to change. The balanced Lisa made a breakthrough in her research, and she successfully built a prototype jammer that could disrupt swarm communications within a limited range, and she tested it on captured equipment, and it worked perfectly, and the quantum signals were blocked, and the devices went silent, and she rushed to tell Jake, and explained that if they could build larger jammers and deploy them strategically, they might be able to create dead zones where the swarm could not coordinate. Jake immediately authorized the construction of jammers, and every available engineer and technician was put to work, and they built 12 units over the next 2 weeks, working around the clock. And the jammers were large and required significant power, but they were portable enough to be deployed by strike teams, and Jake planned a coordinated operation to use all 12 simultaneously in different locations. Greg briefed his pilots and ground teams on the operation, and they would deploy the jammers near major swarm concentrations and activate them simultaneously, and then attack while the enemy was confused and disorganized. And it was risky, because the swarm would certainly respond with overwhelming force once they realized what was happening, and everyone understood this might be a one-way mission, but they volunteered anyway. Amy coordinated the timing across all 12 teams, and they were spread across 3 continents, and communication delays made synchronization difficult, but she worked tirelessly to ensure everyone was ready, and the operation was scheduled for dawn the next day. And that night Amy barely slept, because she knew thousands of lives depended on perfect coordination, and she checked and rechecked every detail. The operation began exactly at dawn, and 12 teams activated their jammers. Simultaneously and across the world, swarm forces suddenly went silent, and their perfect coordination vanished, and confusion spread through their ranks, and human forces attacked immediately. 3 months into the war, and Earth was a shadow of its former self, and entire cities lay in ruins, and billions had died, and survivors lived in hidden camps and underground shelters, and the swarm controlled most of the planet's surface, and their ships filled the skies like locusts. And Jake Harrison commanded the resistance from a network of bunkers connected by tunnels deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, and every day brought new reports of losses and defeats, and he struggled to maintain hope. Dr. Lisa Martinez made a discovery that changed everything, and she found patterns in the swarm communications that suggested they were not just invading Earth, but terraforming it, and the atmospheric composition was slowly changing, and temperatures were rising, and she realized the swarm intended to make Earth suitable for their biology and incompatible with human life. And when she told Jake the news, he felt rage and determination, because now they knew time was running out. Captain Greg Stone led a series of raids against swarm terraforming stations, and his teams destroyed dozens of the facilities. But there were hundreds more, and they could not destroy them fast enough, and Greg lost more pilots and soldiers with each mission. And the casualty rate was unsustainable, and he knew they needed a better strategy. And during one mission he captured intact swarm computer systems and brought them back for Lisa to study. Amy Chen intercepted a strange transmission from deep space, and it was not swarm origin but something else entirely. And the message was encrypted, but Amy worked with cryptographers to decode it, and when they finally broke the encryption, they found coordinates and a simple message that said, help was coming. And Amy rushed to tell Jake because this might mean humanity was not alone in fighting. The swarm Jake was skeptical because the message could be a trap or a mistake. But Amy insisted it was genuine, and she had verified the signal originated from outside the solar system. And Jake decided to send a response even though it might reveal their location, and he authorized Amy to transmit their situation and coordinates. And then they waited, hoping whoever sent the message would arrive in time. Lisa studied the captured swarm computers and found something incredible. And the swarm was not a natural species but a weapon created by an ancient civilization to fight their wars. And somehow the weapon had become independent and turned on its creators, and spread across the galaxy, consuming everything in its path. And Lisa realized the swarm had no higher purpose except to consume and grow. And this made them even more dangerous. The Resistance discovered they were not the only humans fighting. Back in groups around the world had organized themselves and were conducting their own operations. And Jake established contact with leaders in Asia and Europe and Africa. And they began coordinating efforts and sharing intelligence and resources. And together they were stronger. And the global resistance became a unified force with Jake as the overall commander. Greg trained new pilots to replace those lost in combat, and volunteers came from all over seeking revenge for lost families and destroyed homes, and Greg saw determination in their eyes but also fear. And he taught them everything he knew about fighting the swarm and surviving in combat. And some would die on their first mission, but he gave them the best chance possible, and that was all he could do. The swarm launched a major offensive against the Rocky Mountain bunker complex, and thousands of enemy soldiers and hundreds of ships attacked simultaneously, and Jake ordered all defensive systems activated, and every available fighter launched, and the battle was fierce and desperate, and human forces fought with everything they had, and the bunker shook from explosions and sections collapsed. But the defenders held their ground. Lisa evacuated her lab with critical research data because sections of the bunker were compromised, and she fled deeper underground with her team. And explosions followed them, and dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. And one of her assistants was killed by falling debris, and Lisa kept moving because stopping meant death. And she reached a secure section and immediately set up a new lab and continued working. Amy coordinated the defense from the communication center, and she directed reinforcements to critical areas and called for support from other resistance cells. And her voice remained calm even as the situation deteriorated, and she saw the tactical display showing red icons overwhelming blue ones. And she knew they were losing, but she kept working, because giving up was not an option. Greg flew sortie after sortie against the swarm ships attacking the bunker, and his squadron was outnumbered 10-1. But they fought with skill and courage, and Greg destroyed 3 enemy ships before his fighter was damaged and he barely made it back to the landing bay. And the mechanics worked frantically to repair his fighter while Greg caught his breath, and then he launched again because the battle was not over. The battle lasted for 18 hours, and the bunker suffered heavy damage, but the defenders held, and the swarm eventually withdrew after losing hundreds of soldiers and dozens of ships. And Jake surveyed the damage and saw bodies of fallen comrades and destroyed equipment and collapsed tunnels, and he knew they could not survive many more attacks like this, and they needed the mysterious help that Amy had received a message about. 2 days after the battle, a new signal appeared on long-range sensors, and Amy detected ships entering the solar system. But they were not swarm vessels, and the signatures matched the coordinates from the mysterious transmission. And Jake ordered defensive positions but also prepared a diplomatic team, because these newcomers might be allies, and everyone watched nervously as the unknown ships approached Earth. The ships belonged to a species called the Remnant, and they were survivors of civilizations destroyed by the swarm, and they had banded together to fight back and hunt the swarm across the galaxy, and their commander contacted Jake directly and introduced himself as fleet leader Kalen, and he offered to help humanity fight the swarm and share technology and tactics, and Jake accepted immediately because humanity needed any advantage. They could get Kalen explained that the swarm could be defeated, but it required destroying their central nexus, which coordinated all swarm forces across multiple star systems, and the nexus was located in a massive ship at the heart of every swarm fleet, and destroying it would cause the entire fleet to become disorganized and vulnerable, and Jake realized the ship must be in orbit around Earth, and they just needed to find it. Lisa worked with remnant scientists to locate the Nexus ship, and they used specialized sensors to detect the unique quantum signature it emitted, and after hours of scanning, they found it hidden among the swarm fleet, and it was enormous and heavily defended, and attacking it would be suicide. But it was also their only chance to win the war, and Jake began planning the assault. The remnant provided advanced weapons and shield technology to human forces, and they trained pilots and soldiers in new tactics designed specifically to fight the swarm, and Greg attended briefings with remnant commanders learning about their experiences and how they had survived encounters with the swarm, and he realized humanity had been fighting blind, but now they had knowledge and tools that might make victory possible. Amy established communication protocols with the remnant fleet and coordinated the combined forces, and she worked with alien communication officers who used different technologies and languages, and together they built a unified command structure. And Amy felt hope for the first time in months because humanity was no longer alone, and the combined fleet was much more powerful than human forces had been. Jake planned the assault on the Nexus ship with Kalen and other remnant leaders, and they studied the defenses and identified weak points and calculated attack vectors, and the plan was complex and required perfect timing and coordination, and thousands would die even if everything went right. But success would cripple the swarm and give humanity a chance to reclaim Earth. The assault force assembled in secret locations around the world, and they consisted of human fighters and remnant warships and ground forces ready to exploit any opening, and Greg commanded the fighter wings, and he briefed his pilots on their role in the attack, and everyone understood this would be the most important battle of the war, and possibly the last. Lisa developed a special weapon based on remnant technology and her own research, and it was a virus that would infect the Nexus ship's systems and disable its defenses and allow the assault force to penetrate its shields, and the weapon was untested, but theoretical models showed it should work, and Lisa loaded it onto Greg's fighter because he would lead the initial attack. The night before the assault, Jake addressed all forces through a video transmission, and he spoke of courage and sacrifice and the importance of what they were about to do, and he reminded them they were fighting for humanity's survival and for the billions who had already died and for future generations who deserved a chance to live free, and his words inspired everyone and filled them with determination. Amy spent the night checking and rechecking all communication systems because the assault required perfect coordination, and any breakdown in communication could lead to disaster, and she worked until she was exhausted, but she could not sleep, because tomorrow would determine whether humanity survived or perished, and she sent one final message to her family, telling them she loved them and hoped to see them again. Greg sat in his fighter waiting for the launch order, and he thought about all the combined fleet broke through Earth's atmosphere and accelerated toward the swarm fleet orbiting above, and Greg led the fighter squadrons in tight formation, and behind them came the remnant warships and human cruisers, and the sky lit up with engine trails and weapon fire, and the swarm detected them immediately, and hundreds of enemy fighters launched to intercept, and the greatest battle in human history began. Jake watched from the command center as the tactical display showed blue and red icons clashing in orbit, and the battle was chaotic with fighters weaving between capital ships and explosions lighting up the darkness of space, and he coordinated defensive positions on the ground in case the swarm counterattacked the bunker, and Amy relayed orders to all units, keeping the complex operation synchronized. Greg engaged the first wave of swarm fighters and his targeting systems locked on, and he fired and enemy ships exploded and his squadron spread out in combat formation, and they fought with skill learned from months of desperate battles, and the remnant fighters flew alongside them, using advanced weapons that tore through swarm shields and together they pushed deeper into the enemy fleet. Lisa monitored the virus payload in Greg's fighter and waited for him to get close enough to the Nexus ship to deploy it, and the ship was massive and bristling with weapons and surrounded by defensive screens, and it sat at the center of the swarm fleet like a queen surrounded by workers and soldiers, and Lisa knew getting to it would cost many lives. The remnant warships engaged the swarm capital ships, and the battle between these giants was awesome and terrifying, and beams of energy carved through space, and missiles streaked between vessels, and shields flared under impact, and ships on both sides took damage and exploded. And Jake watched one remnant cruiser get overwhelmed and destroyed, and he felt the weight of every life lost. Greg lost 2 wingmen to enemy fire, but he kept pushing forward, and his fighter took hits that damaged his shields and scorched his hull, and warning lights flashed on his console, but he ignored them and focused on his mission, and he could see the Nexus ship ahead, and it was even larger than he expected, and it glowed with an eerie light and seemed almost alive. Amy coordinated bomber runs on swarm defensive positions, and waves of human and remnant bombers attacked the Nexus ship's shield generators, and they succeeded in destroying several and creating weak points in the defenses. And Greg received the coordinates for the weak points and adjusted his course and accelerated toward the opening, and enemy fire intensified, trying to stop him. The Nexus ship launched its own fighters, and they were different from regular swarm vessels and larger and more heavily armed, and they moved with intelligence that suggested they were controlled directly by the Nexus. And they formed a wall between Greg and his target, and he realized getting through would require everything he had. Greg called for support, and a dozen remnant fighters broke formation to help him, and together they engaged the Nexus defenders. And the battle was intense, and Greg's skill and experience made the difference, and he weaved through enemy fire and took shots when he could, and slowly they fought their way closer to the Nexus ship and the weak point in its shields. Lisa watched Greg's approach on her monitors and calculated the optimal release point for the virus, and she transmitted the data to his fighter and prepared to guide him through the final approach, and she saw his fighter taking heavy damage and wondered if he would survive long enough to complete the mission. And she whispered encouragement, knowing he could not hear her. Jake saw the casualty reports mounting, and thousands had already died, and the battle was far from over. And he made the hardest decisions of his command career, ordering units to sacrifice themselves to create openings for others, and every order meant sending people to their deaths. And he bore that weight, because someone had to, and leadership meant making impossible choices. Greg reached the weak point in the Nexus ship's shields, and he was alone now because all his supporting fighters had been destroyed, and his fighter was barely functional, and alarms screamed in his cockpit, and he had one chance to deploy the virus, and he armed the payload and aimed for the precise coordinates Lisa had given him, and he fired. The virus missile penetrated the shield and struck the Nexus ship's hull and burrowed inside before detonating and releasing Lisa's weapon, and for a moment nothing happened, and Greg thought it had failed, and then the Nexus ship began to change, and its lights flickered and its weapons went silent, and the entire swarm fleet hesitated as their coordination broke down. Lisa saw the readings from the Nexus ship and shouted in triumph because the virus was working, and it was spreading through the ship's systems faster than she had predicted, and the Nexus was losing control of the swarm fleet, and the hive mind was fragmenting, and she immediately transmitted orders to all forces to press the attack while the enemy was vulnerable. Jake ordered the full assault, and every ship and fighter attacked simultaneously, and the swarm fleet was in chaos with ships colliding and weapons firing randomly, and the human and remnant forces exploited the confusion and destroyed hundreds of enemy vessels, and the tide of battle turned, and for the first time victory seemed possible. Greg's fighter was dying, and he had lost all weapons, and his shields were gone, and his life support was failing, and he pointed his fighter away from the battle and tried to reach safety, but a swarm fighter locked onto him and fired, and his ship exploded, and Greg ejected at the last second, and his emergency beacon activated, and he floated in space, watching the battle continue without him. Amy detected Greg's beacon and immediately dispatched a rescue team, and she tracked his position and guided the rescue ship through the battle, and they found him drifting and pulled him inside, and Amy felt relief wash over her because Greg was one of their best and they could not afford to lose him, and she informed Jake that Greg was safe. The Nexus ship was dying, but it fought back, and it launched a devastating attack on the human fleet and destroyed several cruisers and hundreds of fighters, and Jake watched the casualties mount and wondered if the price of victory was too high. And then the Nexus ship's reactor went critical, and it exploded in a massive fireball that could be seen from Earth's surface. With the Nexus destroyed, the swarm fleet lost all coordination, and the ships became independent entities, no longer connected by the hive mind. And they continued fighting, but without purpose or strategy, and the human and remnant forces systematically destroyed them, and the battle that had seemed impossible to win was now turning into a rout. Lisa monitored the swarm communications and confirmed the hive mind was gone, and the remaining swarm forces were operating on basic programming, and they would fight until destroyed, but they could no longer adapt or coordinate, and she realized they had done it, and they had actually defeated the swarm. And tears ran down her face as relief and grief mixed together. The battle continued for hours as the combined fleet hunted down every remaining swarm ship, and ground forces attacked swarm positions on Earth, and slowly the alien presence was eliminated, and the skies began to clear, and refugees emerged from hiding to see the stars again without enemy ships blocking them, and people cried and cheered and held each other. Jake stood outside the bunker for the first time in weeks, and looked up at the sky and saw only friendly ships and the sun shining through. And he felt exhausted and old and hollow because victory had cost so much and billions were dead, and Earth was scarred and broken, and he wondered how long it would take to rebuild and whether humanity would ever recover. Greg recovered in the medical bay, and his injuries were serious but not fatal, and he would fly again, and other pilots visited him and they shared stories about the battle and honored the fallen. And Greg realized he had survived another impossible fight, and he felt grateful and guilty because so many others had not survived, and he vowed to make their sacrifice mean something. Amy compiled the final casualty reports, and the numbers were staggering, and over 3 billion humans had died during the invasion, and thousands more in the final battle, and she wept as she read the names and thought about all the families destroyed and all the futures stolen, and she knew these numbers would haunt her forever. Fleet leader Kalen met with Jake in person, and the alien commander expressed respect for humanity's courage and fighting spirit and explained that the remnant would help rebuild Earth and share technology and knowledge, and Jake thanked him, knowing humanity would need all the help they could get, and they discussed plans for a combined defense network to prevent future invasions. Lisa began planning the reconstruction effort, and she worked with scientists from around the world and remnant experts, and they developed strategies to reverse the atmospheric damage and rebuild infrastructure and restore ecosystems, and it would take decades, but it was possible. And Lisa felt purpose again, because there was important work to do. The world governments reformed, and leaders from every nation met to discuss the future, and they agreed humanity needed to unite and work together, and they established the United Earth Council with Jake as the first military commander, and they began the long process of rebuilding civilization from the ashes of war. 5 years passed since the Great Battle, and Earth was healing slowly, and cities rose from the ruins, and forests grew where battlefields had been, and the sky was clear and blue again, and ships traveled between Earth and new colonies on Mars, and the moons of Jupiter, and humanity looked outward to the stars with hope instead of fear. And Jake Harrison stood at the memorial for the fallen, remembering all those who had sacrificed everything. The memorial was a massive structure built on the site of the Colorado bunker, and it held the names of every person who died fighting the swarm, and millions of names carved in stone. And Jake visited often, bringing flowers and standing in silence and thinking about the cost of survival. And he saw other veterans there, and they nodded to each other in understanding because they shared memories that civilians could never comprehend. Dr. Lisa Martinez became the director of the Global Science Institute, and she led research into advanced technologies and worked to prevent future invasions, and her team developed early warning systems that monitored deep space and could detect threats long before they reached Earth. And she also worked on terraforming technology to make Mars more habitable, and her contributions to rebuilding civilization were immeasurable. Captain Greg Stone commanded the United Earth Defense Force Fighter Academy, and he trained new pilots and taught them the lessons learned from the war, and his students admired him and hung on his every word, and Greg was tough but fair, and he made sure every pilot was prepared for combat, because he remembered the price of being unprepared, and he would not let another generation die needlessly. Amy Chen served as the Chief Communications Officer for the United Earth Council, and she built and maintained the global network that connected all human settlements, and she worked with remnant engineers to integrate alien technology and improve communication systems, and her work ensured that humanity would never be isolated or unprepared again, and she took pride in making sure everyone stayed connected. The alliance between humanity and the remnant grew stronger, and they shared technology and culture, and fought together against swarm remnants that appeared occasionally in distant systems, and humans and aliens worked side by side, building a better future and learning from each other, and the galaxy became a safer place because of their cooperation. Jake retired from active command but remained an advisor to the council, and he spent his time writing his memoirs and teaching history at universities and visiting schools to talk about the war and its lessons, and young people listened to him with respect and asked questions, and he always emphasized the importance of courage and sacrifice and unity, and he hoped future generations would remember. Lisa made another breakthrough and discovered how to reverse engineer swarm biotechnology and use it for peaceful purposes, and she developed medical treatments that could cure diseases and repair injuries and extend human lifespans, and her work saved millions of lives and earned her recognition across the galaxy. And she was nominated for the first Interstellar Science Prize. Greg married Amy in a ceremony attended by thousands of veterans, and they had 2 children who would grow up in a world at peace. And Greg taught his children about courage and duty and the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves, and he hoped they would never have to fight the wars he had fought, but he made sure they were prepared just in case. The Earth Defense Force grew into the most advanced military in known space, and they patrolled the borders of human territory and responded to threats and provided aid to species threatened by remnant swarm forces, and humanity became known as defenders and protectors, and the galaxy looked to them for leadership and strength. And Jake felt proud of what they had become. Fleet Leader Kalen retired and chose to live on Earth, and he became a close friend to Jake, and they spent evenings talking about the war and the future and sharing wisdom and perspective, and Kalen taught Jake about other civilizations and their histories, and Jake taught Kalen about human culture and music and art, and their friendship symbolized the bond between species. Lisa discovered evidence of the ancient civilization that created the swarm, and she led an expedition to their homeworld and found ruins of a great empire destroyed by their own weapon, and she studied their technology and history and learned valuable lessons about the dangers of creating weapons you cannot control, and she published her findings so others would not repeat their mistakes. Earth's population slowly recovered, and new generations were born who knew the war only from history books and memorial visits, and they lived in a world of peace and prosperity and technological advancement, and they took for granted the safety and freedom that their parents and grandparents had fought to preserve, and Jake worried sometimes that people would forget, but he also took comfort in their innocence. Greg commanded a mission to hunt down the last major swarm concentration in the galaxy, and his fleet traveled for months to reach the distant system, and they fought a fierce battle and finally destroyed the last Nexus ship and eliminated the swarm threat permanently. And when he returned to Earth, the celebration lasted for days, and humanity declared an official end to the war. Amy developed a new communication protocol that allowed instant communication across any distance using quantum entanglement, and her invention revolutionized space travel and exploration and made coordinating defense forces much easier. And she received awards and recognition, but she remained humble and focused on her work and continued improving the systems. Jake was invited to speak at the 10th anniversary of the Great Battle, and he stood before millions watching through broadcasts, and he spoke about the fallen and their courage and sacrifice, and he reminded everyone that freedom was never free and required constant vigilance and dedication, and he challenged the new generation to honor the past by building a better future. Lisa received a message from a distant star system, and the species there had detected swarm activity and requested help, and humanity responded, immediately sending ships and soldiers and scientists, and they helped the alien species defend their world and drive away the swarm, and afterwards the species joined the alliance, and humanity's circle of friends grew larger. Greg trained his successor, to command the fighter academy, and passed on his knowledge and experience, and he felt satisfied knowing the next generation of pilots would be well prepared, and he retired to a farm in Montana with Amy and their children, and they lived simply and peacefully, and he finally found rest after years of war. The United Earth Council expanded its mission and began exploring uncharted regions of space and making first contact with new civilizations and offering friendship and alliance, and humanity became known as a species of explorers and warriors and diplomats, and the galaxy was better because humans were in it. And Jake felt proud of what humanity had accomplished. Jake wrote the final chapter of his memoirs on a quiet evening in his home, and he reflected on the journey from the dark days of invasion to the bright future humanity now enjoyed, and he wrote about the people he had known, and the sacrifices they had made, and the lessons learned through hardship and loss, and he hoped his words would inspire future generations. Lisa accepted the position of Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Council, and she represented humanity in discussions with dozens of species, and she advocated for peace and cooperation and scientific exchange, and her diplomatic skills matched her scientific genius, and she became one of the most respected figures in the galaxy, and humanity's voice was heard because of her. Amy developed a network that connected every inhabited world in the Alliance, and information and culture flowed freely between species, and barriers of language and distance were overcome, and the galaxy became smaller and more connected, and Amy's work laid the foundation for a truly unified galactic civilization, and she was remembered as one of the great pioneers. Greg received a surprise visit from Jake, and they sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching the sunset, and they talked about old times and lost friends, and the strange path life had taken them on, and they laughed and cried and felt grateful to be alive, and to have survived when so many had not. And they knew their friendship would last forever. Jake attended the graduation ceremony at the Fighter Academy and watched young pilots receive their wings, and he saw hope and determination in their faces, and he knew humanity's future was secure because new generations stood ready to defend it. And he felt his life had meaning and purpose, and all the struggles and sacrifices had been worth it. 20 years after the war ended, Jake Harrison died peacefully in his sleep at age 78, and the entire planet mourned, and world leaders and common citizens alike attended his funeral, and millions lined the streets as his casket passed, and he was buried at the memorial with full military honors, and his name was added to the wall among the fallen heroes. He had commanded. Lisa gave the eulogy at Jake's funeral, and she spoke about his courage and leadership and unwavering dedication to humanity's survival. And she told stories that made people laugh and cry, and she reminded everyone that Jake would want them to continue building the future he had fought to preserve. And her words inspired millions, and Jake's legacy lived on. Greg stood at attention during the funeral and saluted his old commander and friend, and tears ran down his weathered face, and he remembered all